Welcome everybody to the Impact Policy Podcast. My name's Sam Johnson. I'm the Managing Director here at Impact Policy, and I'm a proud Jara and Ewan man who grew up on Gadigal country here in Glebe. Now live in Maroubra in South Sydney with my young family, and we maintain strong connections to the Aboriginal communities in which we live as well. Now I wanted to give a bit of an intro to myself and to the podcast because today's episode is a really special one. Today's episode is episode 21, and you might be listening along and thinking, well, what's so significant about 21 episodes? And I thought the same thing until I was talking with a producer recently who told me some interesting statistics. And one of them was that most podcasts, 90% of podcasts don't make it past the fourth episode. And out of that 10% that are left, only 1% of that 10% make it past episode 21. So today is a bit of a celebration for us, recognizing that we're in the top percentile of podcast producers. So I don't know if that means we're anything special than anything else that's out there, but I guess what that does reinforce is that we're trying to be consistent, trying to be committed, and trying to really deliver something that's a resource of value for people that are passionate about the stuff that we yarn about. So before I go any further, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge country. I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we're on Bidjigal country. I want to pay my deepest respects to our elders, both past and present. I want to recognise that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land, and that it was never ceded by treaty, and that wherever in this country that you might be listening to this podcast from today, I want to pay my deepest respects to the countries that you're on as well. So before I go any further as well, I just want to take a moment to thank everybody that's listening to this right now. When we started the Impact Policy Podcast, we had no real idea of where it could go. It was very much a passion project, and it quickly turned into a bit of a purpose project, to be honest. And it's completely self-funded and self-driven. We have no sponsors, we have no partnerships, and the reason we've been able to keep going and keep producing what we've been able to produce is because of the support of listeners like yourself that watch along through YouTube or listen along online through Spotify and other platforms too. So honestly, we've had some tough times, over the year and a bit that we've been producing this, and you question sometimes because producing a podcast requires so much resources. It requires so much time and so much effort, particularly if you want to do it really well. And we made a real commitment early that we wanted to have guests on that really added value for listeners in terms of navigating social policy, in terms of really elevating and centering lived experience, and also really centering, for the most part of guests across this series, the significance of Aboriginal cultural knowledge and wisdom and how that can really inform and impact how we think about social policy more broadly. So, the messages that I've received from, many people here over, the past 20 plus episodes about what you've got out of these episodes, the value that you've received and the networks that you've shared with them within. Honestly, I've said to people it means the world, and I don't understate that because it really, really, really does. So honestly, thank you so much for being a part of this journey with us. It's really just the beginning and we're just warming up, but episode 21 is a significant number. And I was driving over and, this is my first solo podcast experience. And the reason it's my first solo podcast experience is because my guest cancelled on me. And so, we've got a really exciting episode lined up with him soon. But I thought, how fitting to have my first crack at a solo podcast then at episode 21. So here we are today. And if I can ask you anything from this episode and from your connection with this series, is it would go a really massive way if you could take a moment to subscribe to us on YouTube, and if you could, rate our podcast where you listen to it online through Spotify as well. So, like I said, we have no sponsors, we have no funding, and, that sort of stuff really goes a long way for us to be able to, build our profile and get this series out to as much people as possible as well. So the structure for this episode, really, coming over and like I said, thinking about, okay, how are we going to do this one out? What's going to be the best way that's going to add the most value? For me personally, I probably don't really enjoy solo podcasts as much. And I really wanted it to be an episode where I wasn't just talking about myself or, trying to, really add something that was valuable. And so what I actually thought is, what would be a good layout is if we actually go back in time and look at the series and do a bit of a reflection and a bit of a key takeaway around what the journey's been like so far. So that'll give us, particularly if you're listening to this and you've joined the Impact Policy series later in the journey, you might connect with some of these episodes that I touch on and the things that we explore, and it might prompt you to go listen and understand a bit more deeper too. So that's sort of the structure that we'll go through for today, and then talk about what the future looks like and go from there. So best place to start when we reflect on the impact policy journey is going back to episode 1. Now, I have to give a shout out to our original producers and sponsors of this podcast, Amanaki Studios, good friends of mine that we've partnered and collaborated with over the years on many different projects, and they really supported us to get this stuff off the ground. Now, episode 1, we interviewed Adam Hansen. Adam Hansen's a senior program manager of community engagement at City of Sydney Council now, but he's also one of my oldest friends, someone I grew up with, and did a lot of growing with that fella from a very young age. And so I guess that episode really for me was about, announcing myself into this sort of space and doing it alongside someone that I respected, but I also, had a really deep and personal relationship with. So, if you're someone who is interested in issues around youth homelessness, social disadvantage, and overcoming trauma, that's probably a really valuable episode to try and check out. So both myself and Adam, in short, we grew up together in Glebe. We've known each other since we were kids, and we both found ourselves homeless as young people. And so we were lucky to also get support through this same youth accommodation service, which was pivotal for us as young fellas that were trying to, transgress that trauma and disadvantage that we were living in as well. So, really, really special episode. He's gone off to do amazing stuff in his life that you can hear about when you listen to that. But I think some of the most important things from that episode as well, particularly for, people that are working in the service design space and people that are working in youth policy and things like that as well, is how that we can start to think about systems and processes and programs that are accessible for young people that are experiencing a range of different challenges in their lives and aren't just sort of designed around addressing, singular issues or symptomatic issues of a larger and broader, more problem when, talking about trauma and social disadvantage. So that was my first episode with Adam. Please check it out. It's one that's close to my heart. And actually, he's going to come back on the series very shortly as well, because we recently just got a small community grant through the City of Sydney to record a podcast mini-series. So we'll record a range of episodes that look at issues around the City of Sydney, social policy issues more broadly, but issues that aren't, just specific to that LGA. So, we'll have guests that are from, different community and stakeholder groups that explore that sort of stuff. But, those episodes, we aim to add value for people that are trying to understand that stuff more broadly outside of those communities as well. So stay tuned for that. That's really exciting and it's coming up soon. From there, I went into some really exciting stuff, some sort of key highlights, I guess, so far. And one of the most highest viewed episodes that we've had to date has been with Federal Secretary Jim Betts. So at that point in time, prior to impact policy, I'd worked really closely with Jim Betts in the state government. Watched him absolutely come in and transform a government organisation in terms of really leading with value, like that values-led leadership, and watched and supported that change management process of really reimagining a vision and values for an organisation, and really saw the specific impact that meant for Aboriginal staff as well. having had been there before he was there and seen the impact of his leadership there as well. So someone who's, really courageous leader and gave me so much, I guess, permission to be myself more in those public sort of spaces. If you watch that episode or if you've ever come across him in the past, you know that he doesn't present as the traditional senior public servant physically and how he dresses and all that sort of stuff as well. And for someone who, working in that sort of sector and space sometimes felt like they were out of place or on eggshells, he was a breath of fresh air in terms of being able to be authentic and what authentic leadership meant, and how to really, drive significant and strategic change too. So it's a really significant episode for people to watch that are working as leaders if they want to work towards sort of strategic change and impact. And also if they're aspiring to be a leader and they want to understand that journey, the vulnerability that he shares along that experience is something that, I think will resonate with everybody. And that's something that, many people can get out of as well. So that was it. I think it was episode 4 with Jim Betts, and it was our most viewed episode for a long time. And it's still up there as well as one of the most significant too. So I guess, when we talk about and reflect on these episodes at Impact Policy, one of the most significant things is that, we're an Aboriginal organisation, we're Aboriginal led, we've got Aboriginal staff, and we work across social policy portfolios that impact our communities. But this podcast is not an Aboriginal specific podcast. We've got guests that come in from all types of backgrounds, from all types of industries. And whilst the majority of our guests are blackfellas, the reason around that is about centering Aboriginal knowledge, culture, wisdom, and lived experience in terms of how we think about these social policy problems that we're navigating more broadly, and in terms of how we think about all that knowledge as solutions to what we're trying to look at. So not thinking about our communities and our families and our people as a separate problem that needs to be fixed, but actually looking at our people and our families and our communities as the solutions that can add value to the challenges that we're navigating as a society more broadly as well. So, really specific about and intentional about how we've tried to design this podcast experience to be like, so that it can be accessible for everybody, and that, you could come and you could listen and watch and be a part of this series if you're passionate about, hearing about design and co-design, and you want to understand and unpack that more. But you might be listening to that and hearing practical examples of what that looks like in Aboriginal communities, and frameworks and principles around how that's really done well. And, that a lot of that is informing your own way of working and where you go to from here, potentially, if that's been a valuable resource. And so, it's a really pivotal point that I wanted to make, because I really want this to be a critical piece about what impact policy is about as well. Impact policy, we're an organisation, we specialise in engagement, co-design, communications, research and evaluation, and, policy design. And they're all critical elements of what builds strong policy. And for so long, our people used to ask like why would you call, like, what is it about impact policy, or why would you call an organization impact policy? Really, the reason about that is about, for so long, policy was used as a weapon against our communities. It was used as it was a dirty word across our communities. Being an ex-social worker, policy often got in the way of being able to achieve significant impact sometimes for families and communities. It was the reason or the legitimization of tearing families apart, or keeping kids in custody. And so impact policy is really about actually reclaiming what we believe informs and designs and builds best practice when we design policy together. And so it's about thinking about, I reflect back on this series and think about some of the big themes that we've looked at, and we've looked at stuff like decolonisation and decolonising theory and what that looks like. We've had a few different episodes that really do a deep dive and explore that. We've looked at co-design and how do you build stuff together better with people that are impacted and affected by the things that you're trying to look to create. And then we've also, really looked at trying to center lived experience and, elevating that expertise around those stories. And so in many ways, ironically, the podcast series has really brought out some core themes about how we sort of do what we do at Impact Policy, and some of those really underpinning sort of values around our business and what we sort of do here too. So that's been a really natural and sort of organic, I guess, flow of the series as it's gone so far. But it also really reinforces, I guess, how we do what we do and our values and all that sort of stuff there as well. So yeah, it's been an exciting journey. And so, we kicked off the episode with Adam. We've spoke to federal secretaries. I had a good friend on, Joe Gaines, and we did a real deep dive into domestic and family violence. And that was a really significant episode, really personal episode. And it was one that, one I'll never forget. And it's pertinent. One of our most recent episodes we did with Regan Mitchell, again, was around domestic and family violence. And we're at a national crisis. We've been at a national crisis for a long time in terms of violence against women. And both those episodes take, particularly Joe's, is around her lived experience of what that was like as a child, and the work and advocacy work that she's doing now. And then the episode we had with Regan at episode 19 was really about, at a strategic and systems level, what we need to sort of understand and what we can maybe do as well to try and reimagine a better future together. But I have to admit, some of these episodes have been, triggering in many different ways. Some of these issues that we talk about, I have my own lived experience with as a young person, and, being able to try and hold that space for guests and hear those stories, and then thinking about our listeners like you that are listening along in terms of trying to pull out something that can give you a resource to consider, maybe if you're navigating something similar, or, a reflection or a question to explore as well, is always some of the biggest challenges. And I just want to take a moment to thank, people like Joe and others that have been on, that have been brave enough to share those stories. And, I think it's our responsibility. I've reflected a lot around that domestic and family violence space since a lot of those conversations. And, it's one of those things that I just feel like is so complex, in the sense that, I guess for me, I'm very passionate about trauma and healing. And so when I think about the violence space, manifestation of violence, working as a criminologist, and that's been my background, I know that, for the most part, many people that are in custody and incarcerated have experienced complex trauma as young people. And so when I think about, violence manifesting in our community, whether it's, someone who's been arrested or convicted or caught up in the criminal justice system, I keep thinking that a lot of that stuff comes back to manifestations of trauma. And how does trauma manifest in different ways? We know it manifests in alcohol and drug use. We know it manifests in poor sense of self, poor social and peer relationships, poor mental health, and all this sort of stuff as well. We talk about access and use of pornography and addiction in those sorts of spaces, gambling addictions. A lot of these things, that they're all interconnected. And so when we talk about trying to, and again, I'm not qualified to really give anything definitive. This is just my reflections based on thinking and listening and, having these conversations with real leaders in these sorts of spaces, is that for much of this sort of stuff, tackling it directly can only get us so far sometimes. I think there's some really big and critical pieces of the puzzle that we're not talking about. You know, the fact that whether it's, you know, last night was the state of origin. I don't know if it's a state of origin, but I know it grew around the grand final time. There's a real spike in domestic violence rates and stuff like that. And you know, I'm again just gonna like hypothesize that it's probably got nothing to do with football. It's probably more to do with gambling, more to do with alcohol, maybe drug use, and maybe other factors there as well. But I think, you know, if we really want to, you know, yeah, there's a thinking about this problem is complex and it's broad and there's a range of different ways that you can tackle and approach it. I think we need to be also having some really bigger and broader conversations around some of these other social indicators that are impacting this issue around violence and men perpetrating violence against women as well. So that's my real just reflections based on what I've been thinking about and listening and sort of seeing too. So yeah, that's you know, again, just want to thank you so much, Joe, and thank Regan for coming on and being vulnerable and feeling safe enough to have some of those conversations with me. It's really meant so much. I think coming in to after we'd had a few episodes under our belt, I got offered the opportunity to come on Osher Gunsberg's podcast series, Better Than Yesterday, and Osher's podcast is you know massive. It's, you know, probably one of the biggest in Australia at the moment, and through some mutual connections, through some community organisations. I guess he's a massive advocate for Bernardo's Adolescent Services, which is a foster service that I was at when I was a kid. So I think through that relationship, me and Osher were connected, and Osher got me on to his series, and we had a yarn about a whole range of stuff, I guess my story, my journey, and it was coming up to Survival Day, like January 26th, but it wasn't because it was Movember. So that would have been November. I had this really filthy moustache. I never wear a moustache. And so now whenever I watch that podcast online, I just cringe when I look at myself because I think I look like a real deviant. But yeah, I jumped on Osher's podcast, shared some of my story around my experiences, and then, you know, in exchange, I said, "Brah, please, can you come on my podcast?" And I knew a bit about Osher's story, but I listened to his audiobook and I was blown away by it, to be honest. Because, you know, I guess in terms of age, he's probably like, you know, close to 10 years older than me, but I sort of grew up watching him on Channel V and all that sort of stuff as a presenter. So I always had memories of him on TV from a young age, and then, you know, watching him through Australian Idol and all that sort of stuff. And his book reflects on, I guess, that journey, but he goes really deep into his mental health, his addiction, you know, his psychosis, his diagnosis, and what that was like. And, you know, really, really hit home for me. For me personally, you know, my mother dealt with complex mental illness. She was diagnosed, she had schizophrenia. She dealt with a lot of the same challenges that Osher talks about as well. And so I guess hearing him share that part of his experience and his story was really powerful for me, for someone who has lived the experience of seeing a family member with that. But what it really reaffirmed to me, though, is actually how, you know, like amongst all this real mental health breakdown and stuff that is navigating in the US and here, he still managed to maintain a really significant public profile. His career at different stages went from strength to strength and was doing all this sort of stuff. And I think for me, I really wanted to get him on and have a yarn with him because I really wanted to try and peel back the face of mental health, you know, because a lot of people that are, you know, so many people are experiencing issues around their mental health, and not a lot of people talk about it, or there's a stigma around people that do have issues around their mental health. And there's, you know, there's like a ceiling around what people think that people can achieve if they are experiencing issues around their mental health. So for me to see someone like Osher, who, you know, is on prime time television, appearing and functioning really, really well, to be able to navigate and talk about, the issues around his mental health, his addiction, his healing journey, really in-depth detail down to the types of medication he trialed and not trialed and what worked and what didn't. I thought was really important for people to hear because, again, it's about, for me, for people that listen to this podcast, I like to think that our listeners, they're allies, they're change makers, they're people that are passionate about social policy and social impact. And so they come and they listen to this podcast because they want to take away tools, they want to take away lessons or understand experiences that can help add value to them, to their worlds, to their areas of expertise that they work in. Now, the significant thing about Osha's story and some other people as well is that it also gives those listeners permission to hear that and to go, okay, maybe I can resonate with him. Or maybe if I do experience, a challenge at some stage in my career now or later, I can understand and know that I am not alone. And there are other people out there that have navigated really tough times, but have still maintained, their professional credibility and have gone from strength to strength and, really just tried to give a different space for people to think about mental health and stuff like that too. But yeah, so, thank you so much, Osha, for being a part of that. And it was funny though, like I was talking to Andrew, who was producing the series, and, by far our most famous guest on the series so far, had been so far, but was like easily our least engaged with and viewed. And I remember sitting there thinking like, I thought honestly that would blow up a bit more and there'd be a bit more engagement. And then, Andrew said something really important. He was like, well, it probably really reinforces who your audience is as well. And so, maybe I could have communicated a bit more what I'm saying now in terms of the impact of that story and what I hope people would get out. But, look, if you are listening and you are someone who is passionate about mental health, or, you're looking for something that might give you a bit of an inspiration around dealing with tough times and still maintaining your professional credibility and career and trajectory, then please check it out. It's, him as a professional yarner, he can talk all day. So, highly recommend that episode. It's really, really significant. So from there, we had Osha that day, and then the next day we had a young fella, Dylan Voller. Now, this is our highest viewed podcast to date. And, at the time of recording this episode today, it is up at like close to 3,000 views on YouTube. I'm not sure of the numbers off of the top of my head on Spotify. And so Dylan Voller was a young person who you might remember from the Four Corners episode a number of years ago, where there was a young boy in prison in Dondale in Northern Territory who was restrained with a spit hood, and there was a range of abuse that happened to him as a kid in custody. And I remember the day I watched that at home with my kids. I remember crying watching it. Like, there's no way you could watch that sort of harm to a child and not be impacted. And same thing with one of my other kids. Really viscerally affected by what we saw. And then the next day triggered a royal commission into Dondale. So I got connected with Dylan through some mutual people that I knew, and we've been connected online through social media for a while. And I thought, what, it would actually be really good to have a yarn with him. And I didn't want to have a yarn with him about the trauma and experiences of the past, but I wanted to maybe more focus on where he was at now, what the future looked like, but also reflections around that sort of service experience and justice journey and what was missing and what could have really, really worked for him as a young person. So, he's such a great speaker. He's a really good communicator, and he had some really good insight. He's someone that just completely came off his own bat. I offered to, I know he's a young fella who's, still on his healing journey, and offered to try and, compensate him for his time. He wouldn't take anything. and just really wanted to share some space. And so if you're someone who's passionate about the justice space, the youth justice space, stories of lived experience, then you want to hear something that's just raw and authentic, then by please check out that episode with Dylan. So that maintains our, I don't know, you probably notice if you're listening, we're not an organisation. We produce this, whilst there's a lot of purpose to this podcast now, it's still very much a passion project, and you don't see us massively promoting and advertising and actively sharing the series online. And so despite that, it's been over 12 months and Dylan's episode still trends as the most viewed across all the episodes so far. So I think that speaks to the relevance and the impact of what that episode can be for people that are listening along as well. So yeah, thank you so much, Dylan. So they're probably some of the highlights from the first half of the Impact Policy podcast journey. And then the next half is really, I guess, the collection of the last 10 episodes and some of the core themes that come up around that. So I mentioned before, like decolonizing theory, co-design, stories of lived experience, that really summarizes the podcast series as a whole. But specifically this end of the this end of the sort of series episodes too. So I've been asked to deliver a guest lecture next week at the University of New South Wales, and it's around decolonisation and decolonising theory in justice. And the course convener reached out to me and she said, "Do you have any readings that you want anyone to read, before the session?" And I thought about it and I was like, I might actually just ask them to listen to a couple of these podcasts. So what I did is I asked them to listen to our episode with Giogi Ravelo, and I asked them to listen to our episode with Brendan Thomas. Now, Giogi Ravelo, he's the professor of social work and policy at Sydney University. And at the time of recording with Brendan was the Group Deputy Secretary at the Department of Communities and Justice in New South Wales. So he held one of the most senior Aboriginal public servant roles in the state. And both of those episodes take a real deep dive into what decolonisation is, what it means from a theoretical perspective, but particularly our episode with Brendan, we take a deep dive into what that looks like at a systems level and at a programs level as well. So to be honest, my episode with Giogi is probably one of my favourites. In terms of engagement and views, it's probably not as high as what I probably would have expected. But personally, in terms of the value that I got out of it, and in terms of the impact that I think that it can have for listeners, I think is really, really valuable. So, if you're someone who's passionate about trying to understand issues around critical whiteness theory, how we think about decolonisation and all that sort of stuff in between, then please check out Giogi's stuff. I came across Giogi's work when I was doing my degree and he'd done his PhD in youth justice. So someone who's got an extensive experience working in the justice space, working in the social work space, and we could really have a lot of these conversations in terms of what they meant around policy and services and communities as well, from a practical level, not just talking about them academically based on someone's research or someone's papers. We did that, but we also talked about how it could look like in practice too. So yeah, someone asked me the other day, like, well, how do you talk about decolonisation, like decolonising, like what does that even mean? How would you describe it, for a 5-year-old? And I thought about it and I was like, well, okay, it's this idea that West is best, that white is right, and that there was only ever one way to do something, and that was the right way. And so, you can sort of, when you think about it like that, you can think about that when you think about a lot of the systems that we live in. When we think about the education system that remains, largely unchanged since it was established. When we think about a range of different, healthcare systems and care systems that have been created that are largely based off of, you know, Western medical models and stuff like that too. And so decolonizing theory and thinking is about reimagining that there was more than one way to understand and design something for a community or for a population, and that this singular sort of creation of a system, particularly in a country like ours in Australia that is so diverse, is, you know, not always not always going to be the most appropriate or impactful for people that are trying to access that stuff too. So yeah, so I mean that's how I would explain it to my kids at home. You know, I'd sort of say, you know, decolonizing theory gives us permission to reimagine different ways to do things. And colonization taught us that West was best, white was right, and that there was only one way, and that was the best way to do stuff. And you know, I used education as an example, and I think it's a critical example because, you know, we really see a massive gap in the education system when we think about how we engage with young people that don't fit within that system and model because of a combination of issues that might be connected to, you know, trauma, developmental, you know, potential issues, you know, broader social factors, and different things like that as well. So we've done a range of work in the flexible learning space, also known as alternative education, and different things like that as well. And we've really looked at, you know, a lot of models that exist across the country, particularly, you know, in Aboriginal communities, but others as well, that have had really significant positive impacts for young people in communities. And again, it comes back to that. It's a decolonizing way of working and reimagining that education can look different, and it can look, you know, we can reimagine something better together. We can co-design something better together alongside the people and the communities in which are going to be impacted and benefit from it too. So it's not to take away anything from the systems that we live within, but it just gives us permission to reimagine that sometimes West isn't best, and sometimes there are opportunities for us to reimagine building better together. So yeah, that was a really powerful episode. Please check it out. That's my highly recommended one. And yeah, really, really powerful one too. So the episode we did with Brendan Thomas, though, that was great because for us at Impact Policy, we do a stack of work with Department of Communities and Justice, particularly around co-design, particularly around research and evaluation and engagement as well. And so that episode, we actually really got to talk about some specific pieces of work that we've got to work on. And in many ways, we got to highlight, I guess, co-design in practice and what that looks like when working alongside Aboriginal communities and communities experiencing complex needs. We also got to talk about, you know, how to, you know, I talked about decolonisation and decolonising theory and stuff like that from an education space earlier. But we did a deep dive into a specific example of what that looks like from a justice perspective, where we reimagined a justice experience that was different to the standard courtroom and experience that we've traditionally always experienced. And I think Brendan articulates it really well. He goes, if you think about colonisation, if you think about our justice system, that's the most colonised thing that we've got. It's largely remained unchanged since it was established here. It's specifically designed in a way where, you know, the judge is elevated and positioned in a way to, you know, exude that power across people that are in that room. And it's always operated as a way like that, and it's been designed like that. But if we look at justice broadly, and this is outside of just Aboriginal communities, our justice system isn't doing a great job in terms of reducing reoffending. And so much of, again, I talked about a lot of that at the start of this episode, and it's filtered through in different ways, is the impacts of trauma. and how that's manifested in a range of social factors that then lead people to offending. And so this project that we got to talk about was really, we worked on co-designing the evaluation methodology for this pilot court. And so it's a courtroom. It operates at the Downing Centre, which is a district court in Sydney. And they didn't have to change a single piece of legislation, a single piece of policy to be able to implement what they've done. And the judges are on board. It operates from a, offender-centric sort of position, in the sense of it's delivered alongside community elders that have cultural authority, but it's centered around why that person is coming before the court. Why are they being charged with X, Y offences? Looking at their offending history, why do they keep coming back into custody for A, B, and C? And it looks like at how to develop a specific case plan about understanding this person's life and the factors that have, got them to where they are, but what needs to be addressed to really minimize the risk that they're going to, come back into custody again in the future. And so, a really trauma-informed approach to thinking about justice. Again, it's not appropriate for all cases and all experiences, obviously. But for the most part, when you think about the prison population and the types of crimes that people are in custody for, it's such a valuable way to think about, how we can actually have a significant impact on potentially reducing reoffending. And, Brendan talks about this is something that could be done for everyone. This is not just specific to our people and Aboriginal communities. This is a way that we could reimagine justice for everyone in our communities. And so that's what's really exciting. That's what really excites me from, again, that decolonizing way of working and thinking and doing is recognizing that there's, giving ourselves permission to reimagine how to do things differently and potentially do things better as well. And so that's a really exciting episode. It's a really specific episode around different examples and project examples and stuff like that too. So if this resonates with you, if you're interested in, co-design and, decolonizing theory or just different ways of working, check it out, because I reckon get so much out of it in terms of real value for what you can take away as well. So they're my two prerequisites for the criminology and crime and justice students at UNSW. So they're the required listening for the lecture next week. And this has been a good warm-up, I guess, to reflect on some of those core points that I want to try and explore there with them too. So yeah, that was decolonisation. And then we sort of looked at co-design, and that's something that we're going to pay a bit more attention to in some of the next episodes that we're going to look at here in the podcast series, because I guess our motivation for co-design came from the fact that as blackfellas, as public servants, people that work in community engagement, we actually get really frustrated with people using the term co-design, because we found that there was little definition around a set of standards for what that meant. And so, it became largely tokenistic and a bit of a buzzword for, I guess, impact that they think that these programs or systems or policies or services, were having. And so sometimes, people were I've seen examples where people would just have one conversation with two people and say they've co-designed a service or, built a strategy off of that's co-designed. And so, but I've actually seen co-design also done really, really well. And I've seen communities, partnered with and worked really closely with and, have a lot of agency and autonomy in determining the outcomes of what we're building together, and have seen the impacts of that. And so being able to take that into what we do now in impact policy has been something that we're actually starting to become really passionate about, because what we really want to do is we want to have what we recognize as a massive need is building our community's agency in terms of being able to assert what they need, require, accept as as principles for co-design. And so we're working on building a framework for our people, but I guess it could be a resource for practitioners as well, around what are those key pieces of the puzzle that people need to understand and know. We're not at the final stages of designing it, but what I would like is something that's really accessible for our people to know that if someone comes in, whether they're a consultant, whether they're government worker or whatever, talking about co-designing something, that they can have a resource and go like, okay, do I have, maybe this is the wrong word, but like maybe tick boxes, like, do I feel like there's enough representation from my community to make decisions about this? Do I feel like I have a sense of power in the decisions that are being made? Do I have the ability to inform the process for how we are going to make decisions or design, things together? Like, maybe it's a checkbox, maybe it's something, I don't know, maybe it's a video resource like this that people can listen to and reflect on before they go into sessions too. But we've seen and really believe that that's a massive gap for our communities, but also for practitioners too. We really passionate about bringing some rigor back to how we talk about co-design, particularly with Aboriginal communities and other communities as well that maybe haven't had as much agency or voice in designing together in the past too. So we really hope that it's going to be something really, really valuable. And that's what motivated me to bring on K.A. McKercher. So K.A. is, she's now a friend of mine, very, very passionate about the work that they do, and is the author of Beyond Sticky Notes. So if you are interested in co-design and you're looking for some resources now more broadly, I could not recommend their book, Beyond Sticky Notes, any higher. They've got a stack of resources and tools on their website, and they also run a series of online training as well. And our team's been to their online training before. And look, honestly, for a world where we often get so much fatigue listening along online and on screens, I actually found their online training really, really engaging. So if you're looking for something to build your capacity at the moment around co-design more broadly, I could not recommend KA more highly. So we do a really deep dive into like, what is co-design? How do we know when it's done well, and all that sort of stuff as well. And so again, though, I wanted to balance that out with how do we think about centering our people's experiences and our people's voices and knowledge and wisdom as part of that too. So I back-ended KA's episode with Nellie Pollard-Wharton. Nellie Pollard-Wharton just completed her master's, I think it was in public health at the University of New South Wales. She was a co-founder of First Nations Response, which is a not-for-profit here in Sydney, and absolute powerhouse. And her episode is one of the ones where we have our youngest guest, because she's got her infant Hazel on the mic with us there as well. And so, but just absolute legend, but someone who's worked in the co-design space from a public health perspective. So through her role with the University of New South Wales, she did a range of public health programs that were in the co-design space. And so we take a real deep dive into what that means for us as blackfellas and what that means from a cultural perspective. We look at, to be honest, we look at a lot of the failings and shortfalls of co-design in the past, based on our experiences and what we've seen. And we talk about, what we actually, really believe best practice can look like. And it's a really, really valuable conversation. It's one of the episodes that's probably done pretty well. And I think for the most part, I guess for me, what I take out of that is I was talking about co-design yesterday with a client that we're working with for some work we're about to kick off. And for me, so much of navigating this space comes back to power, particularly if, for the most part, our clients, they're state government. And so they're asking us to co-design something alongside our communities. They're asking us to co-design something alongside our communities where for so long there's been such an imbalance of power in those relationships, in that engagement, in that participation. There's been, so many failed consultation attempts and representations of people's voices and perspectives in development of policy and strategy in the past. And so we're coming in to try and navigate this sort of space. For us, so much of that is about rebalancing power. And it's about really getting a sense of that and working out how we can create spaces and places that build our people's sense of confidence in the process and give them some power back to determine where we go to from there. And it's one of those ones that when I was talking with Nellie about it, we were reflecting about it a lot, so much of it comes back to as much like sometimes really good co-design for me sometimes as a blackfellow just feels like it's community led. And, there's nuances to that. But I think that's an interesting way to think about it as well. I think it's an interesting way to really think about maybe if we start to think a bit more about, giving our community as much power or as much agency as possible at every stage of this together, co-design almost becomes the outcome of that. But for the most part, we want our communities to be leading it as much as possible where we can. So yeah, look, I'm sure I digress a little bit, but I guess, hopefully that reinforces some of the, most passionate sort of pieces for us here at Impact Policy. We're doing a stack of stuff in the co-design world. We're really excited about the value that we think we can have as an agency to how we think about co-design of systems, policy, services and programs. And we've been a part of some really exciting projects so far as well. So, having these conversations with Nellie, with KA and others as well is just something that I think we're going to get so much more value out of for the sector more broadly in terms of how we do this work really, really well. And I think even if you try and embed some of those principles around co-design, you might get to the end of a process or a project and, not feel confident that you could say that it was co-design. But, I would imagine by sure you're going to have a lot more better engagement as a result of really trying to prioritize some of those core principles around doing that stuff well as a result regardless. So, yeah, hopefully you get some value out of that and you can take away some really core thinking for where we go to from there. And stay tuned. I think our next episode I'm going to get Sean on. So Sean McCarthy, he's one of our directors here at Impact Policy, proud Gumbaynggirr Bundjalung man, someone I've worked with for a long time. And we both, chop it up around the co-design space all the time. So being able to have him jump on and us to take a bit more of a deep dive into some of the stuff that we've done together and in the past and what that means for working with Aboriginal communities and communities more broadly, I think it's going to be something really, really valuable. So if you are passionate about co-design, stay tuned. It's coming soon and I'm really looking forward to it as well. I guess our second highest viewed episode has been with Barker, so Chloe Quayle. Barker is, one of the most leading names in hip hop in Australia right now. Barkindji woman, amazing artist, amazing story, and someone who I can't wait to see the book or the movie about her one day because her story is just incredible. And Barker's episode was really special because I actually worked with Barker when she was in prison as a kid. And so I had this connection and relationship with her from a young age. And then I'd see her in community, when she was struggling, as you do here and there. And then I watched her, come up and I watched her journey. And it just makes me so happy because I saw her at the lowest of lows, and she doesn't hold anything back. She was completely addicted to ice. She'd lost her children. She was in prison. Could not sink any lower to where she probably was in the world. And despite all that, with little resources, has managed to claw her way out of that. And not only has she survived that trauma and that experience, she's thrived, and she's on her way to, amazing things. And she's become such a beacon for our communities in terms of that. And yeah, I mean, that is probably one of the most inspiring episodes to listen to if you haven't listened to it already. And yeah, one of our highest viewed, and is just a story. Like, I can't talk to it too much because it just does not do it justice. But I think we take a deep dive into understanding pivotal parts of her story, pivotal parts of her experience, where things went well, where things didn't go well. Ask her reflections around that sort of stuff and what could have happened better. And she has some real insights into how, services could have been designed or policy could have operated differently and stuff like that too. And I think like that's the real power of this last piece around lived experience. That's the real power of how we pull out the wisdom and the knowledge of people that have experienced this on the front line and being able to really elevate those voices into how we inform the co-design of building stuff better together. So Barker's episode is absolute a critical must watch or listen if you haven't already. And that sort of takes us into the most recent one really, which was with Kobe D. So Kobe Duncan, again, another hip hop artist, getting a bit of a trend here, becoming a hip hop podcast. But I think again, the significance of Kobe's story, again, it's about that elevation of lived expertise. It's about how do we translate that wisdom from that experience into how we understand how we can do stuff better. He has so much messages for people that are listening along online that might be struggling with their own mental health or their own substance use issues. And he also has some really important reflections in terms of how we think about how the services can be designed better for young people as well. He guest lectures at UNSW too. And, we talk about his storytelling and his music, and, one of his tracks, Jody, which is certified gold, is like, I ask about his method and message behind all that sort of stuff. And really, I guess what he's saying is communicating a lot of what we sort of talked about in this podcast so far as well, is that, it's about understanding that, these young people in this example, that the issues around crime and justice are as much a social policy issue as they are a law and justice issue. He talks about issues of poverty, trauma, abuse, childhood disadvantage, complex needs, grief, all these factors that young people experience that don't get addressed, that systems don't access, and they manifest and resonate in criminal justice experiences later in life for a lot of young people, particularly in the communities that are experiencing broader complex social disadvantage and social inequality. And so really that was his message around creating that story and sharing that as well. So I think the ability to be able to do that in such a creative way is something that is so powerful, and is a really significant episode for people to check out as well. So I think our last one I'll probably reflect on. I haven't reflected on every episode because we'll be here for a long time, but I've tried to pick out some core themes or some core episodes that I thought were valuable for people to hear a little bit more about. And this last one is with Vanessa Turnbull Roberts. Now, Ness is the commissioner, first commissioner for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families in Canberra. And it's significant. It's a significant appointment, and congratulate her and all power to her. She's a local woman from here, grew up in Maroubra, but her, like myself, we have a lived experience of forced child removal. So, she'd been removed and was a ward of the state from a young age, was removed from Maroubra, just like my sister was when she was the same age as Vanessa too. And that episode, we reflect deeply around the state violence, I've talked about decolonisation, I've talked about lived experience, I've talked about co-design, but a really significant piece of this, particularly for Aboriginal communities, is the impact of state violence. And state violence can look like the use of policy, law, and power that disproportionately impacts our people and our communities. We know that 1/3 of Aboriginal children that are in out of home care right now that have been taken from their families are there because of neglect. But we know that neglect is a manifestation of poverty, of trauma. That was why my sister was removed from Redfern down at the block where my dad was living. It was one of the same reasons that Ness was removed as well. So there's a significant amount of young people that have been just torn away from their families because of poverty and trauma. And so it was a really personal one because, one, it affected us both, but it's also one that we can impact as policymakers, as decision makers and leaders. These are things that we can do stuff about. We have a system, a child protection system that's failed. We've got rates of removal of Aboriginal kids that are higher than the stolen generation. Like it's absolutely wild to think about. And in many ways, and with no disrespect to our old people, but the stolen generation hasn't stopped. It's still happening today. So, this episode with Ness is really powerful one for me personally because we talk about abolishment. She's really passionate about the abolishment space. But with that, again, comes back into that decolonizing theory sort of space in terms of how do we reimagine how these systems can work differently and work better, and how do we co-design them alongside the families and communities that they impact. And so I just wanted to sort of bring it towards the end with that one. That's probably the most powerful personal one for me in terms of my own connection to it. I guess my journey with impact policy so far, really a big part of it has been about owning my own story and understanding my own story and reclaiming it in a lot of ways. I think for a long time I didn't talk about my lived experience, particularly around forced child removal and out-of-home care. And I thought so much time had passed that it didn't matter anymore, and it wasn't relevant. And the saddest and most tragic part of it is that it's actually hasn't changed, and it is just as relevant as it ever was. And so my experience was almost, sounded identical in reflections with Nessa's. And it's the same with kids that are being taken and removed today. And so if anything, that's really motivated me as a policy area and a passion area for me to really add some value from an academic and professional perspective, but also from a personal and a lived experience perspective, to add as much value into how we make sure that these next 20 years don't look like the last. We have a real significant opportunity to do something different, but it's going to take a lot of courage and a lot of leadership to, really disrupt the system that we've got in place right now that is continually harming and creating this pipeline of young people that are removed from their families into state care that are then, put on this pipeline to youth detention and prison later in life. The statistics reinforce so much of that as well. I can't quote them specifically, but if you watch Nessa's, I know she talks about that sort of stuff in specific detail too. But that's what we talk about when we talk about state violence. That's what we talk about when we talk about the prison pipeline for kids in out-of-home care. And I'm just so proud that Ness, myself and others that we know have been able to transgress that, those spaces and places that we got put in as children, and that we're able to be able to have a voice and be able to do what we're going to do now and into the future as well. So with that, thank you so much for listening along, being a part of this reflection. And it's been so much of a journey, this podcast series, and it's something, again, like I said, that we're so passionate about. And I really hope that if you haven't already checked out some of those episodes that I've talked about, that you take a moment to go and find some of them and listen in on them, because some of these resources people have reached out to us and told us how valuable they are in terms of what they've been able to get out of them. So as much as we like to toot our own horn and big note ourselves that this is amazing stuff, we also have messages and direct sort of inboxes that reinforce that for us as well. So please check them out, and please let us know what you think. Let us know if at the bare minimum you do anything, can you please just subscribe to our channel, leave us a review, and let us know what you think. If you come across an episode that you think has really resonated or you've got something out of, honestly, it means so much when we get those sorts of messages. So if you want to have a yarn in more detail about any of that sort of stuff, that's what we're here for. And I just want to thank you so much. My first solo podcast experience. I'm sure it won't be my last. Thank you for being a part of the journey so far as well. All right. Cheers.